Hoy en día, Cherán es el pueblo de donde soy originario. En este mes cumplieron 3 años de independencia del gobierno mexicano. Este pueblo está ahorita autogobernándose, fuera de la política, fuera del gobierno mexicano. Y ha sido un logro, ha habido mucho esfuerzo en la lucha, ha habido bastantes muertos, pero estamos muy orgullosos de ellos porque con ello estamos demostrando que hoy en día esta cultura y estas tradiciones y esta forma de gobernar después de 500 años está resurgiendo, y es por primera vez que diferentes grupos indígenas de México y también no indígenas que están siguiendo el ejemplo de nosotros, porque está funcionando en estos días críticos de crisis. Y creo para nosotros ha sido un logro y esperemos que sea un buen ejemplo para la República Mexicana y para otras partes del mundo, ¿por qué no? Yo con esto me inspiro mucho porque con ello yo siento que he seguido la misma meta. En primer lugar, desde niño siempre rechacé mi cultura, mi identidad, mis tradiciones, porque quería ser como los demás. Es lo que yo difiero como fue la colonización que estaba yo poniendo en práctica, sin saber el daño que me estaba haciendo yo mismo, porque estaba cortando mi cultura. Y tomó dejar mi pueblo, venir a otro país para valorar lo que en realidad estaba yo perdiendo. Y me di cuenta porque fui abierto a diferentes culturas, pero un día una de tantas culturas me rechazó tanto porque me gustaba este país, me gustaban sus tradiciones, me gustaban sus bailes, y yo entusiasmado como cualquier otra persona que quiere aprender de otros países, decidí ingresar a estas clases de baile y fui rechazado en una totalidad que me hizo sentir decepcionado. Pero últimamente le agradezco a esta persona porque me abrió los ojos, porque me dije yo mismo, vengo de un lugar donde estamos ricos en cultura, ricos en tradiciones, ricos en danzas, que en ese momento decidí yo de explorar lo mío y exponer lo mío a otras personas. Tuve un grupo de danza que estuvo funcionando durante 10 años, después dejé lo de danza y empecé a hacer lo de la pintura. Muchos de mis temas son temas políticos, combinados con símbolos precolombianos, y estoy haciendo una mezcla de cultura antigua, pero también lo nuevo, lo que estamos pasando hoy en día. Y algunas de estas imágenes estoy exponiendo son imágenes del estado de Michoacán que han sido poco expuestas hacia otras personas. Creo son bien conocidas en México, pero no fuera de México. Entonces yo estoy explorando y educándome a mí mismo al mismo tiempo que estoy compartiendo con otras personas de diferentes otros países. Cuando me invitaron al evento, creo para mí ha sido una de las primeras oportunidades que me siento completamente abierto a tratar de exponer lo mío, porque en mis otras pinturas me enfoco más hacia otras culturas como los aztecas, los toltecas, y uso diferentes símbolos que no son propios, pero que me han servido como herramienta para expresar lo que yo quiero hacer. Así es que estoy muy agradecido con todos ustedes y espero que podamos compartir y enriquecernos entre nosotros mismos y estar abierto a todo. Yo he tratado de estar abierto a las diferentes cosas que vengan, porque creo esto es lo que diversifica a a nosotros como individuos y nos hace enriquecernos cada vez más. Y los temas que tomo en ocasiones, o mi mayoría, son temas sobre fronteras. Y fronteras es una espada de doble filo. Sirve para protegerse, pero también sirve para aislarte de las demás personas. Y yo pienso que uno debe de ser intermedio y tratar de hacer un balance entre las dos, porque me imagino que es como funcionaban nuestros antepasados, porque teníamos esa gran diversidad, ese gran compartimiento a diferentes distancias de las diferentes culturas, y he descubierto que del continente americano del sur al norte tenemos muchas cosas en común, y esas cosas en común no creo que hayan venido de la nada. Me imagino que fueron transportadas durante el tiempo del norte a sur, de sur a norte, y es como tenemos todos algo en común. Yo he tenido bastante influencia de mi esposa Lisa, y hemos descubierto que me ha enriquecido lo que ella comparte, porque muchas de las cosas que yo hago es tanta la similaridad que es sorprendente para mí, y esto me empuja a tratar de seguir. Y es una combinación también para mí para inspirar a personas de mi pueblo, porque yo crecí con pocos modelos a seguir. Y creo que eso fue lo que me aisló o me forzó a tratar de ocultar mi identidad, de decir, no, yo no soy indio, aunque la cara está toda indígena. Y es una cosa que tenemos en México, que nos atacamos entre nosotros mismos. No formamos ese modelo a seguir, a sentirse orgulloso de donde uno viene. Y ese es mi propósito, y he tenido bastantes ayuda de muchas personas que están aquí. No voy a mencionar, todos saben, y de una u otra forma han colaborado con ese granito de arena. Y eso me ayuda a mí para seguir adelante y formar ese modelo para las nuevas generaciones hispanas aquí, pero también compartir nuestros conocimientos, compartir nuestra cultura con personas no hispanas, o no importa del color, sabor que uno tenga, pero también eso me ayuda a combatir esa lucha que yo tuve de niño, de no poder sentirme libremente lo que yo era, o creer cosa que en realidad no es, porque me imagino que si uno conoce más es la herramienta para combatir la ignorancia, y a veces la ignorancia no ayuda bastante. Me he enriquecido mucho yo con todos ustedes aquí, me han empujado a seguir adelante. Yo el arte me he enseñado solo, desde luego influencia con diferentes artistas, poca instrucción escolar, pero eso no me ha detenido a hacer lo que yo quiero hacer.
I don't speak any Spanish, except from high school from like 30 years ago. My name's Alyssa Hinton, and I'm a mixed media artist here in Durham. And I have a large fiber installation in the show. It's about, I don't know, several feet across, and we can walk through it. And but I wanted to talk about my work leading up to that piece, to put it into context, and also to be able to relate more to the indigeneity theme of the show. Because a lot of my older pieces, they specifically are dealing with this topic, but kind of times 3, because I'm a mixed race person, I'm triracial, and I come from the colonizer and the colonized simultaneously. So when I think about this topic, my mind just goes crazy because I've been kind of living this this conundrum for a very long time. But in terms of indigeneity, that's why I wrote in their relationship. I just kind of was like seeing all these relationships. But anyway, in terms of indigeneity, in my mother's family, they're from North Carolina. They're indigenous North Carolina. And I don't know how much North Carolina history you know, but here before colonization was the Tuscarora. They were the biggest, baddest, loudest group. They controlled a lot of the economy. And for a while,
Cherokees will say no.
This side. Y'all were over
This
there.
side.
They sit down the mountains.
But basically, in order for North Carolina to become North Carolina, the Tuscarora had to be squelched. But before that happened, there were these colonies where white people and black people both could go and stay with the Tuscarora as long as they followed the codes of the Tuscarora. So you had this triracial thing happening a long time ago, started a long time ago. So that's my background from my mom's side of the family. But of course, that was all swept under the rug. So when I was growing up, we didn't really talk much about it. My mom mentions something sometimes, and my grandparents gave us photographs. And they made up stories. Actually, they made up a story about how my great-grandmother was a Cherokee princess and married my great-great-grandfather and, wore many children or whatever. But it ended up not being true at all after I started to dig into it. So the first thing I wanted to say then about indigeneity in my family is that it was asleep, and that it woke up by way of me connecting to it, to my identity through my art, starting when I was a child. And that process of excavating the family legacy and the tribal heritage and everything, that process created this sort of decolonization process along with it, because I was able to find out a lot of things about my background. So it's kind of like by default, I was decolonizing myself just by digging up this history and culture that has been swept under the rug, just because of the different events in history, slavery, all that stuff. So that's why in this piece, you'll see it's of an Indian mound, but it has burst open on the side, and you can see some old relics, traditional things, ancestors' bodies. There's a drum in there. There's slave shackles. There's a very old statue face there near the top. So pretty much showing all these things that have been submerged for a really long time, and they're getting exposed all of a sudden. And then, so this connotates the idea of a reawakening of indigeneity. So it's a self-portrait, but it's also a portrait of, it's like me, the microcosm, and then the macrocosm, which is my family, my tribal background, and just North Carolina in my mind, how I'm talking about it. And also I have ancestors from Missouri, who later went to Kansas, but they are also mound-related people. So here you can see all these old things, this kind of sedimentation of old things. They're giving new life because there's this little embryo being born there near the top. So through the old, we get this rebirth, and new things come about, new knowledge or reawakening come about. And then the hawk can see the unseeable. So it's about to land on the mound, and it's delivering the same message, this message of rebirth. So that's what was going on with me at the time when I made this. I was teaching art up in Pennsylvania, and I hadn't done my artwork for about 6 years, and all of a sudden I just started seeing these things. I mean, literally, just in the air with my students there in the classroom, and I started sneaking artwork in my teacher's office, and I started off actually doing Xerox art. And you see some Xerox elements in this piece. Because I had to go downstairs to the basement all the time anyway to make Xerox copies for my students. And so I was like, okay, let me see if I can get some artwork in here. And I would make some Xeroxes. And then when everybody was happy and busy making their artwork at their desk, I'd go in my office for 15 minutes and I'd be cutting and stuff. Because this stuff was coming through like Niagara Falls. So this piece called Mum's the Word, Plantation Memory. It's all about how nobody talked about this plantation stuff. Nobody, no mention of Indian slavery, in the history books in school. This was something I came across after, I think I was already in my mid-30s when I finally found out about this. And so here you can see see these sort of ghostly depictions of they're supposed to be my ancestors as slaves on a Johnston County plantation. Johnston County is just east, it's east of Raleigh. It's not far from here, and that's where my folks were. And I eventually inherited property from that plantation, so that was a really interesting experience. And I went down there to snoop around to find the property, first of all, but also to look up my ancestors' names in the Smithfield courthouse. And because they had these big, dusty, heavy books that you could, actually find people in there if you were lucky. And I found them listed as mulattoes, not as Indians, because that was part of the whole society here was you were either black or you were white, you were either a slave or you were free. And so Indians didn't go as Indians after a certain point. They went as a person of color, free person of color, mulatto, something other than Indian, which made it easier for that whole identity to get buried within people's families. So that's what made it harder for me to figure all that out. I also found my ancestors' names on documents that were actually wills. So I found my great-great-grandmother being willed over along with like some furniture and a mule cart and some other stuff to the other plantation down the road. So once I dug that stuff up, I was like, oh my God. I went back to Pennsylvania, and it took me a little while to kind of like digest all that stuff and recover from that stuff. But it really fueled my artwork. So, you can see the red X across the lips up there. The barn, it's more of a Pennsylvania barn, because I'm from Pennsylvania, but if I were to do this piece again, I'd put a good tobacco shack in there. And then you can see people looking kind of refugee-like, because that's basically what happened to Indians all over the hemisphere. Became refugees on our own land, pretty much. And I didn't control any of this. This is all, uncut art here. This piece, as you can see, it's called Homeward. It shows ducks migrating south. And that's basically me moving back to North Carolina from Pennsylvania. In 1997, I decided just to move down here. I left my cushy, comfy job. I had a really good job in Pennsylvania with my students there. I left them behind. I moved down here. I made a pact with myself. I said I'm just going to do my art no matter what. I don't care if I have to eat lentils for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. I'm just going to do this art. I'm going to go to North Carolina. I'm going to be on location. And I'm going to tap into all this buried civilization that's down here in the South, underneath all the stuff here. Underneath Raleigh, Durham, Johnson County, all that stuff, Smithfield. I'm going to tap into that. I'm going to be right there. So my art's going to take off, and that's all I cared about. So I did it. And that's what that piece is about. You'll see the slave shack there on the right. You'll also see a lot of old art from Cahokia, which is the biggest Indian mound, I think, in North America. They say that the base of it is actually much larger than the pyramids of Giza in Egypt. So you see, kind of combining several different things here. It's very ancestral, very southeastern. Trying to find a way to be a southeastern artist and not feel like I had to fit into the paradigm of, the Plains Indian person only, because everything that happened here happened a lot earlier. This is where the frontier started, with some of my English relatives, actually. Okay, so the next piece here, here I used does anybody recognize that photo there? This figure here that's kind of outlined in red. That is Chief Bigfoot from the book Bear My Heart at Wounded Knee. It's a pretty well-known photo. It might be kind of hard to see because the whole piece is pretty abstract, but it's a pretty well-known photo of Chief Bigfoot in death at the Wounded Knee Massacre, which was one of the, I would say, for me, it represents kind of like the subduing of the last free Indians in North America. Once the 7th Cavalry did its damage and massacred all those people, they pretty much didn't have very many problems left out in the West. And for me, it represents the last three Indians. So by showing him here, and I read this book when I was a teenager, and it really affected me permanently. So it was easy to kind of like use that image. But by showing him here floating up, rising up off the turtle's back, I'm pretty much saying, talking about a resurrection once again. Because this, and you'll see there's 7 stars there, so that denotes 7 generations. So, I mean, I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the whole idea of 7 generations later that, you know, because that's like a full cycle. So, people with indigenous background will start to, you know, think that way again. I think this panel here is part of that whole movement. There is a movement going on all across the world. You know, as quiet as it's kept, I feel that it's there. I mean, I can feel it. Things are different now than they were before. So that's what all that stuff represents. And the turtle, the sea turtle represents water and birth. It's like a female principle. So to have Chief Bigfoot rising up off the back of the turtle, which is representing birth, that's also pointing to this whole idea of resurrection. This one's called Turtle Bebe, Fortune 500. If you look closely, you'll see there's Fortune 500 company logos all around the outside. I wasn't being very polite when I made this piece. Basically, this is an environmental plea. You know, I'm talking about, okay, it's good to make money and make profit, but, you know, what about the well-being of living things on the planet, not to mention our own well-being? And the turtle is wearing protective eyewear here because it's protecting itself from the damaging glare of our choices that we made, the choices that human beings seem to make that disregard the well-being of the earth. And so he or she is trying to remind us. She's already seen it all before. She's like, oh man, these people are still doing this stuff. So, you know, I'm basically saying, you know, whether the colonized or the colonizer, at this point, we're all in the same ecological boat with our well-being threatened by our own blindness. So, pretty much what I'm getting at with that piece. And then this leads into my last slide, which is actually the piece that I have in the show here. It's called the Indigenous Iconic Earth Altar. You see the turtle again showing up. That's the one that's in the southern direction, which is the reddish, bluish part of the medicine wheel here. It's a shift in the media that I'm using because this is three-dimensional, it's fiber. It's not paper collage and it's not digital collage. The other ones were either actual handmade collage from my pre-computer days, or they were a similar technique, but you know, using pixels, cutting tools instead of scissors. And obviously, this is like something totally different. But I'm using and combining all those same themes. Really, I'm just kind of tying it all together. And I'm adding traditional handwork, like on the little extensions from the turtle piece where you see beadwork and feathers and whatnot. I'm combining that with the digital tools, digital printing, all kind of recycling. And by doing that, I'm showing an interdependence relating to technology, because I'm using, you know, modern high-tech stuff, and I'm using the age-old stuff as well. Not just the old handwork techniques, but also very old concepts, really powerful concepts that revolve around a holistic understanding of the universe and the human relationship to all life forms, all levels and planes of knowing, all cycles, seasons, all the elements. It just keeps going on and on and on forever. You know, the medicine wheel is a philosophy that basically talks about how we're part of everything and everything's part of us. And it's inherently an environmental statement because by thinking that way, it just automatically makes you look at the whole picture, makes you realize, you know, yeah, you're related to that spider over there. Maybe you should consider not stepping on it before you step on it, or maybe you want to kill it consciously. But at least you would be thinking that way. Then there's another aspect of this that kind of leads into science a little bit, and that is that if you look closely at the medicine wheel, it's got a certain pattern stitched into it. And that pattern, that stitched geometry there, is known as a tesseract or a hypercube. It's a configuration that represents the fourth dimension, which the fourth dimension really is a representation of the spirit plane. And it also is connected to space-time. I heard you mentioning space-time earlier. You know, and that's like a quantum physics term. So what I'm doing here is I'm crossing cultures. I'm trying to show commonality. So I've got the original tesseract design, so you can kind of see it a little more clearly in there, because I've opened up the center of my wheel to show that Native American duality concept of complementary duality. So it kind of liberates the clean geometry in there. But that's really important for me because I think that a lot of cultures actually end up talking about similar things, but they just don't realize it. And so, you know, we think we have to like argue it down and everything, but I really think that, you know, space-time and unity theory, that's the same as the medicine wheel philosophy of we are all related. In my mind, that's got to be the same. So that's why I put it together like that, because I could. And I decided I think it's the same. Same concept. So, and I think we need this non-hierarchical way outlook in order to collaborate and free our minds, free the colonizer's mind, free the colonized mindset, so we can embrace what we have to do in terms of creating a sustainable future. Because we're kind of running out of time, and that's my little soapbox statement, but that's what my work is about. That's what it's about. Especially this piece. Like I said, this piece is the culmination of all my other stuff. This is where I really was like, okay, yeah, I'm indigenous, but I'm also English and I'm also black. And I wanna bring something together that's really universal. But I also want to say we need the indigenous philosophy. Everybody needs this indigenous philosophy to get to where we need to go next. So that's kind of my bit on
Gracias a todas y todos por estar aquí, y quería hablarles un poquito de el trabajo que estoy compartiendo con ustedes en esta exposición. Voy a localizarme yo menos por ahora, porque ya tendremos oportunidad de hacerlo eso, además que se trata de un trabajo que no es de carácter individual, sino es un trabajo grupal. De hecho, los directores, yo soy solo la mitad de esa dirección, la otra mitad es Javier Yazdi, que no puede estar aquí presente hoy, pero que está al tanto de que su trabajo está siendo expuesto el día de hoy. Entonces, este trabajo surge de un momento político-coyuntural muy específico. Esta imagen es del 1 de mayo de 2006, quienes estuvimos en Estados Unidos en esa época podemos recordar, fue un día bastante notable, donde masivamente hombres y mujeres de distintas nacionalidades salieron a las calles o haciendo honor de la fiesta internacional del Día del Trabajo, pero demandando reforma migratoria. Eso fue quizás un momento de esperanza para quienes podíamos ver cómo esta causa tan urgente en la sociedad latinoamericana estaba tomándose las calles. Ese momento de esperanza fue rápidamente silenciado, callado, atacado por una serie mediáticos y respuestas mediáticas, sobre todo que venían de una indignación supremamente hipócrita. No sé si recuerdan ustedes el presentador de CNN, Lou Dobbs, profundamente indignado por el hecho de que algunos de estos inmigrantes presentaran banderas mexicanas junto a las banderas norteamericanas, y esto que había surgido como una presencia pública pronto se convirtió en un espacio de escarnio, y no solamente él, pero muchos otros comentaristas mediáticos empezaron a atacar de forma regular cualquiera de esas iniciativas. Y recordemos que para esa época nuestro gran líder era el presidente George W. Bush, que no tuvo mejor idea sino generar un muro, que bueno, que era parte de todas esas políticas que surgieron desde el 2001 del ataque del 11 de septiembre, que dividiera físicamente los espacios que siempre habían sido uno, pero que tenían como fundamental intención mantener afuera estos inmigrantes, esas presencias incómodas que estaban viniendo y llenando las calles de la ciudad. En respuesta contra este backlash, se respiraba una retórica anti-inmigrante que era muy palpable. Esta pared, que es una pared símbolo, monumento a la infamia y a la hipocresía, era también risible. Muchas veces, no sé si a ustedes les pasó, pero a mí cuando escuchaba alguna de esas retóricas tenía esa sensación que por un lado estaba al borde de las lágrimas, pero que eran supremamente ridículas y cómicas todas las acusaciones que se estaban virtiendo, lo que hizo que surgiera en nosotros una idea de atacar esto con humor, una forma de evidenciar la hipocresía, el absurdo, el ridículo que se estaba gestando en el discurso mediático y político. Y entonces aparece Gringo Next Door como un proyecto absolutamente independiente, que empieza a interpretar ciertas características de la vivencia dentro de los Estados Unidos en ese momento. Básicamente intentamos desestabilizar las miradas que las basamos básicamente alrededor del problema de falta de comunicación, de un misunderstanding entre los que estábamos a distintos lados de las paredes. Y entonces empezamos a jugar con estereotipos desestabilizadores y miradas que cambiaran esa visión. Es decir, cómo nos ven, cómo los vemos, cómo nos vemos a nosotros mismos, y en general hacer una parodia del absurdo que era construir una pared que dividiera espacios que naturalmente estaban unidos. Esos elementos habían de combinarse en nuestra propuesta con una cierta, para ser coherentes con esta desestabilización, con un cambio de la mirada, pero además con el uso de ciertas estéticas muy definidas, que eran, por un lado, el melodrama, muy latinoamericano, entonces estaba imbuida de este melodrama, pero por otra parte también la comedia del sitcom. Pensamos que tenía que, y perfectamente podía utilizar elementos estéticos de ambos campos, que jugaran con estereotipos, con expectativas, evitando maniqueísmos, que dijeran estos son los buenos y estos son los malos, pero que evidenciaran una falta de entendimiento que permitiera simplemente poner en evidencia lo ridículo de todo este ambiente que se estaba viviendo. Eso es todo, no tenía demasiadas ambiciones. El cortometraje se fue a un par de festivales donde recibió más o menos alguna benevolente crítica, Pero cobró vida propia porque un par de años después, en un contexto bastante distinto, Catherine Walsh, que está aquí presente, lo presentó dentro de un proceso de educación con educadores, un auditorio muy grande que incluía educadores de todo el estado de Carolina del Norte y de otras partes, y de repente, y para sorpresa nuestra, el cortometraje empezó a tener gran demanda, demanda que por supuesto no estaba en condiciones de proveer, porque empezaron a recibir correos de todas partes que decían queremos la película, y yo no tenía sino un número finito de copias. Pero en fin, solamente para contarles que en ese sentido el cortometraje cobró una nueva vida en lo que yo encuentro más útil, que es una suerte de herramienta pedagógica multicultural, intercultural diría, perdón, una herramienta pedagógica intercultural que gracias a esos elementos desestabilizadores podría por lo menos plantear o generar debates sobre ese ambiente que se estaba presentando. Así que ese es Gringo Next Door, como les dije, está codirigido por Javier Yasti y Javier Pavón, pero es un trabajo de todas las personas que somos parte de ese equipo, y como es corto y solamente dura 15 minutos, los invito a que lo vean.
Performance language in English. So the piece that is up in the exhibition for me is it's a trajectory of about a year of work around feminicide or feminicide in the Americas. And I have two main through lines through this work that's developed. It started in Guanajuato, in San Miguel de Allende, where I became aware that feminicide was a growing issue, and in particularly in the year 2013 it reached a peak. And feminicide being defined in Mexico as the purposeful killing of women for being women. So as a queer person, for me, I began to trouble this idea of, well, who are these women? And how are we defining womanhood? And then increasingly began to see in places like Mexico City, where there were trans women being killed, that weren't even being considered as homicides. And so the cuerpos desechables, and who are these cuerpos desechables? So my purpose in doing performance work in these communities has been twofold. One has been, how can we use the body as an archive, the body as a conduit, the body as a site for producing activism, producing knowledge, producing awareness, and creating different types of relationality with activists. And the second, which you'll see in the exhibition, has been, how can we trouble the notion of feminicide so that feminicide includes everyone who identifies as female? Which for me is crucial, because the way that I am conceiving of gender in performance is however someone identifies in their gender is how they should be accounted for, regardless of sexuality, regardless of sex. That gender is a self-identificatory site, and that is a site that we can use in performance to locate what is happening with feminicide. The first time that I did this piece was in San Miguel de Allende. It then went to San Cristóbal de las Casas, where I've done it twice, and about a month ago in Toronto. So in Toronto, the conversation expanded to First Nations women. And it was a conversation among 3 First Nations artists, myself and my partner, who does interventions, street interventions around feminicide and Cristóbal. So what it did then was open the conversation to trans, the question of trans, the question of biologically female-bodied women, and First Nations women. And so for me, this work is, each space that I go, that I present this work, I shift body archive. And so what I want to argue for is an archive of the body that is not limited to a theorist called Secular, who talks about the body archive as through criminology and through a very Western, Eurocentric way of thinking about archive and archival materials. And what I'm trying to do is think theory through the body, through gender and questions of visibility and questions of relationality, so that through performance, we're exchanging affective moments where there's something happening. So performance for me is a ritual. Performance is not about my body in space and look at my body doing these things. It's how can the body be a mediator different types of relation that is a form of activism, and it's a form of calling these women into the space. So that it's not this morbidity. And every time that I'm saying women, from now on, I'm also including trans women and First Nations women. So it's not a question of morbidity. Let's remember these tragic deaths that were beyond death, because oftentimes these women were displayed in very grotesque ways. I mean, organs ripped out and put on, just thrown out. So that this sort of looming, you could be next question. But calling their lives into the space. And it also, through doing performance in this way, public interventions, we found, we being the activists, being the people that I'm always in conversation with, because I always perform in the communities that this happened in, is to create a public space for mourning. And to say, because the audiences include activists, they include family members of women who were killed, they include human rights lawyers, and they include everyday people. How can we create a public space to call attention to the issue, to have a space for mourning, and to have a space to come into dialogue and say this is an actual issue, and how are we going to move forward? So then what do we do in creating awareness, and then how do we push the question of justice forward? Because most of the times in these cases, they're met with impunity, meaning that the men who commit these crimes, and they're probably 99% men, go free, while the families continue to try to reckon with and mourn the loss of this body, this person, this spirit in their lives. And what we have seen in San Cristobal, by calling attention to the issue, in 2 or 3 cases, people were brought to justice. So for me, this continues to cause me to reflect and think through how can we continue to be very intentional and purposeful and protect ourselves and advocating for justice for the families and for the community members, and what role does performance as public intervention and performance as performance art do in leading towards this call for justice. So the last thing I'll say, because I'm going to do part of this piece tomorrow, is I have a very trained body, you can probably tell by how I stand, trained in classical ballet, modern dance. Moving into performance for me was to say, how can I not do all of these movements in a way that shows that I'm clearly a ballerina, because it's not about the aesthetic quality of the movements in this type of work. So I went through a lot of Buto training. And Buto is a Japanese art form that came after World War II as a response to U.S. interventionism and the amount of deaths and the amount of violence to bodies, and it's a very grotesque way of moving. And it comes from the muscles closest to the bone. And you're not thinking about the aesthetic composition of the work, but you're moving images and you're moving spiritual elements through the body, and the movement surges from there. So every time that I've worked through these pieces, I've started with that type of movement. And so for me, it's that movement creates a different relationship to the audience. I think it's a way of invitational performance and saying we are all co-performing and witnessing together. And it's a way of calling other bodies into the space with us. So for me, intervention is the body as a site, the body as a conduit, the body as a location for politics, and for calling towards justice against impunity. More tomorrow. Thank you.
Hola, yo soy de Guatemala. Bueno, tengo 5 minutos.
Tiene más tiempo mañana.
Sí, porque el sábado me toca hablar un poco más de mi trabajo, ¿verdad? Entonces, eso es lo que pasa en Guatemala, ¿verdad? Cuando entré, dice. ¿Ya?
Okay.
Bueno, sí, digamos, en el 2002 fui al periódico, ¿verdad? Uno de los periódicos más importantes de Guatemala, fui a denunciarme de que me había desaparecido, ¿verdad? Entonces, como otro amigo cómplice, yo fui mismo a dejar en la oficina de la señorita, y lo chistoso es que no me vio, ¿verdad? Entonces, pues me dice, digamos, sí, está seguro que desapareció por el minuto. Bueno, ¿verdad? Digamos, esto salió también, también fuimos a dejar en noticia de televisión, también fuimos a dejar en las radios, ¿verdad? Entonces, todo salió, ¿verdad? Y ya en mi pueblo, de donde yo soy, 200 kilómetros de la ciudad de Guatemala, indígena 100%, ¿verdad? Entonces, es la primera vez cuando el pueblo se unió, ¿verdad? O sea, ahí está dividido políticamente, está dividido entre partidos, entre equipos de fútbol, ¿verdad? Es la primera vez que se perdió Benvenuto, ¿verdad? Hasta el alcalde dijo, ¿qué vamos a hacer, ¿verdad? Y resulta, esto yo no le dije a nadie, ni a mi papá, ni a mi mamá, a nadie, ¿verdad? O sea, fue un poco chocante y entonces, pues el teléfono que apareciera era mi teléfono, yo mismo lo usaba, ¿verdad? Pues, para mucha gente fue algo chistoso, pero esto es lo que sucede en Guatemala casi diario, ¿verdad? Entonces, pues pasó eso y yo vengo de una escuela académica pues, de arte, ¿verdad? Ya, entonces, como me dijeron, haríamos tanto estudio, tanto desvelo para hacer estas babosadas. Esas son cosas lo que a mí me interesa. En vez que una denuncia, para mí el arte no es una forma de denunciar, sino que es una forma de anunciar, ¿verdad? Yo creo que estoy anunciando esto. Entonces, yo sin saber que existía la descolonización, la decolonialidad, existía... no sé, ¿verdad? No sé, eso no sabía, eso lo que yo quería es hacer un poco diferente, digamos, lo que se hacía en mi pueblo, ¿verdad? Pues en mi pueblo es un pueblo pintoresco, ¿verdad? Pintoresco, hay más de 200 pintores en el pueblo y son dos comunidades muy importantes de la pintura popular, como lo llaman en Guatemala, ¿verdad? En San Pedro de la Laguna, donde yo soy, y Comalapa, ¿verdad? Entonces, igual, o sea, digamos, ya cuando recuperé más o menos mi conciencia, quiero hacer algo diferente, pero algo diferente como un qué, ¿verdad? Entonces, como estudié pintura y no me gusta pintar, ¿verdad? Entonces, lo que yo hice, si para mí, pues, digamos, pintar es una forma de borrar, ¿verdad? Borrar. Entonces, también como que estoy tratando de sanar una herida, ¿verdad? Y cuando leí que hay una herida colonial, pues aquí sí, ¿verdad? Entonces, esto es una Biblia en Sutujil, lo que yo hablo, Sutujil, también está en castellano, español, ¿verdad? Entonces, lo que yo hice es pintar el español, ¿verdad? O sea, el castellano, entonces solo se quedó en Sutujil, ¿verdad? También hice en cachiquel, en quiché, en Pocomuchiva, como hay 22 idiomas, ¿verdad? Entonces, es una forma de alejarme, digamos, de los pensamientos, de estructuras occidentales, ¿verdad? Entonces, eso es para, cuando yo pienso, digamos, una forma de alejar, pero me estoy obligando a acercarme, y acercarme, lo más importante para mí es la tierra, ¿verdad? La tierra que estoy viendo, ¿verdad? Porque nosotros, los indígenas, nuestro pasado no lo tenemos atrás, sino que lo tenemos adelante, ¿verdad? Entonces, esa es una forma que lo que estoy buscando, ¿verdad? Buscando en el arte, buscando en todo eso, es como, ¿dónde escondieron mi ombligo? Cuando dicen, ¿qué estás buscando en el arte? Mi ombligo. No estoy buscando nada más, sino que estoy buscando mi ombligo, ¿dónde escondieron? ¿Verdad? Entonces, esto, lo que está pasando en Guatemala, ¿verdad? Digamos, es una Guatemala desnuda, una Guatemala ya esqueleto, ¿verdad? Porque eso es la forma de un papalote o de barilete, ¿verdad? Entonces, lo que hice es quitar lo que sobraba. Entonces, eso es una forma, digamos así, metafórica, digamos que Guatemala lo tenemos así, ¿verdad? Entonces, ya el sábado lo voy a continuar más con mi trabajo. Solo los dejo aquí nomás. Muchas gracias.
Jeff Marley Dagwado, Ani Kaduagi, Nole, Ani Jiswahili. Hello, I'm Jeff Marley. I am of the Kadua people, also commonly known as Cherokee, and I'm also from Birdtown community on the Follow Boundary. Most of my artwork has been, stems from a point in my artistic endeavors where I essentially was avoiding my own culture in order to express myself. And coming to the realization that the longer I do that, the more I hurt myself, I hurt my family, future generations, and then I also hurt the memories of my ancestors. This is an installation I did for my master's thesis at Vermont College of Fine Arts. This was kind of the culmination of what I had done. I started off in the program as a painter and got more into installation, ceramics, printmaking, site-specific installation, performance, and this piece is a combination of all that. A lot of the paintings in this have to do with the Cherokee language, the syllabary. That was invented by Sequoyah in the 1820s. And just a little note on that, Sequoyah created the written language when he was literate in no other language. I hate in the history books how they say Sequoyah was illiterate. Well, of course he was illiterate. He didn't speak any of those other languages except for Cherokee. But they make it sound like, well, he should have spoken English. But he created the language in the early 1800s, and within 2 years of creating the language, 60% of the tribe could read it. So that led to the advent of newspaper, printing, which I'll get into some more. But with this piece, I wanted to incorporate the language because I myself, my history with it, growing up, I would go visit my great-grandmother who was she was a full-blood member of the tribe. And when we would talk about language, she would say things like, well, that would be, oh, you know what? I shouldn't tell you that. You'll get in trouble. And it was all related to her experiences with boarding schools. So a lot of different processes were going on there from her that handed down to me, which I got asked some questions like, well, this language, I know a little bit. I can't speak a lot of it because there's that disconnect from her generation to like my grandmother, my mother. You know, I didn't realize that there was a lot of little things that they were doing to preserve the culture and pass on the culture, but the main things, the spirituality, language, had all been stripped from her because of her experience in boarding school. And so the main thing, like with the mask above, the painting, you can't see the painting that's hanging, but the painting that's up there is actually a painting of my great-grandmother that I did in 2005. And so the point of the installation was to incorporate a lot of older things that I had created, a lot of older, meaningful things from my family, but then also these activities that would occur when I go visit my grandmother, or and also making the connection with my father. He was not tribal or indigenous, but he was a Vietnam era veteran, which of course that's a tremendous example of colonialism. America coming to aid France, their good colonial buddy, and the conflict that ensued from that. But I kind of feel like his participation in that lent something else. And so his service medals are part of this, as well as part of this has to do with my daughter, who, because of identity standards, recognition standards set forth by the federal government, which then translates to the tribe setting their own enrollment. She is not a tribal member. She's what they call a first-generation descendant. But I've been telling everybody she's free. That's what she is. She's free from all this junk and garbage that we have to go through because the government wants us to maintain a quota of our people. So I can talk for hours and hours and hours about this stuff. But these are two of the masks that, again, this is part of the installation that's over in the gallery. Both of these are stoneware. This one is, I call it the grandmother's mask, and it's meant to represent my great-grandmother. And the farther one there is the father's mask, and it has an open mouth because he liked to talk. And in the performance, I talk a lot too. So, one of the things that I like to research and do within my work think of things in a historical context, using, memories from growing up, but also, recollections from other elders and stuff. And one of the things in the performance that I do when I take on this persona, I call up the memory of my great-grandmother, and I take on this persona, is every time I'd come over to her house, she would offer me something to eat, and it's usually bread. And it didn't matter, I'd be like, no, Grandma, I just ate dinner. She'd be like, no, you sure you don't want some bread? You need to eat, it's important to eat. So, and thinking back on that, and then, being able to talk with other people that I've grown up with, other people from other tribes, and that's like, there's a common practice of that, like just offering of the food whenever you come into that memory that's a commonality between all tribal groups and stuff, with all tribal people, indigenous people. Using the mash to kind of bring that up to, I don't want to say extract it, but actually to amplify it. A lot of my work too, I like to use masks as not to hide my face, but to amplify my identity as an indigenous person. This is from a recent project. I actually collaborated with a printmaker that I work with, a book artist named Frank Brandon, and we went to, this is the print shop at New Echota Historical Site in Calhoun, Georgia. This syllabary word here is Shki-Gateno-Hechti, which translates as two different things. It could mean in the context, we are coming, or it could also mean be looking for us. We had talked about going to New Echota to print because through our work at the community college that I work at, we actually revitalized the printing type for Frank did through various grants and research and stuff. But we revitalized the printing type, so now we have 4 different sizes of syllabary printing type, and we thought it was time when we went in October of last year to print in syllabary at New Echota. This is significant because in 1835, of course, Treaty of New Echota was signed. In 1834, the Cherokee Phoenix ceased printing. They ceased the press in 1835, and then they forced everyone to leave in 1838. And so, in 178 years, no one had bothered to go and try and print at New Echota. And I think that being the place of this first newspaper in an indigenous language, that there was a lot of power to go and do that, but also to recognize the people that lost their lives because of this, act of colonialism, this forced removal for land, which when you go there now, it's like, wow, you guys did so great. There's a golf course over here. How wonderful. You did so much, more improvements than we would have done with it. But, and that's the other thing I like too, is a little segue there. If you haven't noticed, I like sarcasm and humor in my work. I want to show you something in a second. But I also like the complexity of, when you look at history and in terms of colonialism, but then also decoloniality. When you look at history, you can't say, well, why did this person decide this? Look at all the pressure and stuff that they have on them. You can't pull this figure from the past into the future and then say, well, if he was here, he would decide this. You have to be there with them. You have to move back into that space where that person was in the past and understand that before you can then take them and move into the future with them. But this is the press that they have there. It's not the original press. Georgia Garden is that in 1835, but we did get to use. This is a still from. There's a video on my website, 8-minute video of us, Frank and I, and the folks there printing. Of course, this is the type, and the Cherokee syllabary is here, and the English up there. And when we did this, Frank and I actually, we switched. Frank set the Cherokee language, and I set the English language. But little did we know we were keeping with the tradition of the newspaper, because the newspaper, when it was printed, had one one Anglo editor, and then the other one was a Cherokee member. So we unwittingly kept with that. But, and then, of course, this is a copy of the poem, and another match performance that I do. I was talking about the humor. This is the booger, or shkili. Booger is a term that actually comes from like a early Scottish, when the Scottish settlers were coming in for bogey or devil. And the Cherokee would engage in this activity called the booger dance. That essentially what it was a wonderful night like tonight, where there's some serious conversation going on before we got serious. Boogers would come in and cause all sorts of trouble, and there'd be a lot of irony in their activities that would be relating to the subject matter and things that we were going to be serious about later on. So the boogers would come in and grab the women. They'd come in and try and steal the food. They'd pick fights with the men. They'd harass the children. They'd do all this crazy activity until they were forced to dance and leave. And then magically there'd be these 5 or 6 other people that showed, oh, sorry, we're late. Did anything happen while we were gone? But it was always prearranged, but not, amongst this group, but not amongst the rest of the participants. But it acted as a little bit of comic relief, but also to clear the air of any tension, anxiety before things got a little bit more formal. But I use this to actually talk about things that I would get in trouble otherwise in some of my normal job duties, normal day-to-day activities. The booger has shown up, and when I went to the University of North Georgia, they have, at Dahlonega, they used to have a U.S. Mint, which is why they removed the Cherokee from the area to harvest all this, to mine all this gold. And so the booger shows up, and he goes over to their white marble marker talking about the site of the first federal mint in Dahlonega, Georgia, and sprinkles some corn on top of the monument, all Johnny Depp from the Lone Ranger movie.
Let's not talk about it.
But again, playing into that, oh, here's your Hollywood moment. Let me give you a good trade with the corn. But then also burying the corn in front of this monument to kind of perpetuate this silly myth that, it's all through the community. When you go to Dahlonega, Georgia, there's all this stuff. The Indians hid the gold in the mountains. And it's just like, what are we going to do with that? It's a rock. So I hid the corn there, and then that perpetuates the myth. But also, it was really interesting. Whenever I do this performance, the interaction with the audience, because there's always like this at first, this very uneasy laughter. It's very like, all right, what are we about to get into? And as things develop, the booger does this thing, and then finally we get everybody and we move in one large dance motion, which is kind of related to something else that we do in one of our touristy things in Cherokee. But again, it's the irony of that as well. And then the booger just runs off, so they're kind of left to deal with each other after this intervention, if you will. I had somebody commented that when I did my dance performance that I had to grab the blonde-haired girl. So, as kind of dealing with that stereotype thing of the Indian running away with women, the savage. The only other thing I wanted to add to that is like some other things that I'd like to look into. I've been doing a lot more with the printmaking and stuff. That I find that to be very interesting. That when you think of things in a traditional context, that it's not very far back in the history, especially as progressive as the Cherokee tried to be, as the encroachment of colonization and the encroachment of settlers. It's very interesting to look back and realize that 180, 160 years ago we were doing things that people today just, I think it's like, it still amazes me. So, but anyway, I'll talk more panel discussion, and you'll see more at the receptions.
No, yo no voy a proyectar nada, también tengo 5 minutos, entonces voy a aprovechar. Puxicale y voli telepisha de Chicolnikesh. Mi espíritu, mi alma, mi esencia le saluda. Chaknulki sabatintan, chen kashticuchi balukilo awikilan, chen beti kup el puilwa yetelo. Yo, Pate que ni canti leche le buca acabota mata. Yo trabajo con la lengua escrita, escribo en un principio narrativa, hace poco empecé a trabajar un poco con la cuestión de poesía. Descubro la poesía erótica precisamente al hacer una receta de cocina junto al fogón de mi abuela mientras hacía tortillas. Me dictaba cómo se hace el pipián de venado. Entonces empecé a copiar la receta en maya y al hacer una traducción al español me sugirió un poema erótico. Entonces me dediqué a hacer un recetario. También yo trabajo con la lengua escrita y tampoco tenía de alguna forma muy cercana el conocimiento con lo decolonial, la decolonialidad y todo este proceso. En 2010 tuve la fortuna de escribir una novela que se llama Danzas de la Noche. Por cierto, quería compartir con ustedes la noticia de que en los próximos meses esa novela va a estar en todas las escuelas del país. Entonces, la noticia me llegó y realmente me siento muy emocionado al pensar que los yunziles, las deidades mayas, me acompañan. Yo le decía a Raúl que los yunziles no necesitan visa ni pasaporte para venir con nosotros. Entonces, lo que yo hago es un poco como parte de la historia, incluso en la historia de México, la historia de Yucatán, se omite en muchas ocasiones las partes que son de alguna forma dolorosas en la historia de Yucatán. Se habla muy poco de lo que hizo Fray Diego de Landa al quemar todos los archivos mayas. Después de haberme enterado de esto en la escuela precisamente, me dedico a hacer cuentos imaginando que vivo en esa época y qué tipo de cuentos se hubieran contado en esa época. Entonces hago una relación de historias que yo le nombré relatos nocturnos, recordando de que cada vez que la luz se iba en la casa nos contaban historias para que pudiéramos dormirnos. En muchas ocasiones era para asustarnos y no dormirnos. Entonces hice este libro que todavía está también en proceso, se llama Relatos Nocturnos, un poco de imaginando qué es lo que contaban en la época antigua, en la época de cuando esos libros fueron quemados, ¿no? Y también yo estudié educación artística en la ciudad de Mérida, en la capital del estado de Yucatán, y la educación artística es prácticamente todo es occidental, danza clásica, todo es occidental, y al momento de hacer trazos, dibujos, ahorita estoy en el proceso de desaprender todo aquello para volver a empezar desde cero, ¿no? Como mi herramienta de trabajo es la palabra y la letra, el lápiz y la pluma y el papel, estoy ahorita en el proceso de usar el papel como, en lugar de escribir texto, escribir o dibujar, trazar aquello con el lápiz, incluso, o sea, cambiar el lápiz normal con el lápiz de color y usar ese elemento en algunos dibujos que incluso van a estar en la galería, en la exposición. Y también trabajar siempre con la cuestión de las cosas que nos habían prohibido, esto no lo puedes hacer, esto no lo puedes hacer o aquello, ¿no? Por ejemplo, en mi caso, siempre había que tener el cabello corto toda la vida, al rape chiquitito, creo que porque también salía más barato no ir seguido, pero también era porque tenerlo largo era símbolo de que no es, tenerlo largo es para mujeres, ¿no? O usar algún el collar llamativo también era relacionado con eso, y la propuesta que yo traigo es precisamente tiene que ver con esto. Y para cerrar, el texto de Danzas de la Noche precisamente va a estar en todos estos espacios. El texto fue escrito en letí, en el maya, En el maya no tenemos una separación entre el él y el ella, entonces hay una sola voz que fluye, que fluye. Ese texto, al hacer una traducción al español, necesariamente tengo que decir ella o él, pero en maya es un letí que aplica para él y para ella. Cuando el jurado calificó el texto, estaba completamente seguro de que iba a ganar una mujer, y resultó que no fue así. Entonces ese fue el mérito que tuvo también el trabajo. Y el texto que les leí en un principio, en maya, se los voy a leer también en español, también porque descubrí que en los textos que yo trabajo, por la memoria que tengo de la lengua maya, se manifiesta en que no deja del todo claro si es un él o un ella. De todos modos, en maya no lo necesitamos. Dice en español: desnúdate delante de mí, déjame buscar los lunares de tu cuerpo, déjame hacer con ellos una tortilla de frijoles, así te comeré junto con todas las noches que tomas de mí.
I also want to honor the land that we are on and the indigenous peoples of the land and their struggles and their resistances that are with us. The project that I would like to talk about, let's see, is actually a project that I think is very much indebted to many of the people in this room. It's a project that has emerged over many years of work in collaborative media production. And so for a long time I've been so interested in the ways that media making can be participatory. So the screen itself just being kind of one moment in a process and everything else around it being as important. I was just going to go to display. Yeah.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah, this is just going to play in the background. This is actually a piece that I made to show at a conference that some of us went to in Toronto last fall. That was a decolonial aesthetics conference that was really super important for, I think, our conversation about decolonial aesthetics, and in particular the kind of provocation that was posed to us about the role of indigeneity in how we're thinking about a decolonial aesthetics. So the piece is called Agua Cine, Water Cinemas. 3 years ago, I was part of the Decolonial Aesthetics, was it 3 years ago? 4, Decolonial Aesthetics exhibition that took place in Bogota and also here at Duke. And I remember that one of the responses that I got from the piece that I showed then, which was called Hotel Panama, about the Panama Canal, was from Catherine Walsh, who, when listening to the piece, said, you could go deeper into the flow of the water. And I realized that she was hitting on something that was super important to me, which was precisely the idea of the canal as a space of interculturality, a space in which we could excavate a history of both coloniality and decoloniality. But the idea of the water then surged forth as, in fact, a space for further building, for further growth. And so then, through the work that I've been pursuing over the past year or so, has been trying to understand how water might then provide a space for both my own reflection, transformation, ongoing engagement with media as a space of critical and creative production, but also how it might invite a collective reflection on water, and in particular on the question of the cosmologies that water might evoke, that indeed create a space of a kind of planetary indigeneity. So this has taken on several different iterations, both, I'm going to now just kind of skip forward in this actually. Let's see. These are just some shots from the previous piece that I was talking about. So this is all stuff that we don't have time for me to go into, so I'm trying to be super brief here. So I've been doing various explorations, and I've also been in conversation with other artists who are doing work around water. This piece in particular that you're seeing is a piece by a Panamanian artist, Enrique Castro Rios. And in it he's imagining a world without water. And so it begins with this kind of dream sequence of a woman swimming and losing her daughter in the water. I also have been researching struggles such as the Ñabe people who are fighting against the building of the Barro Blanco Dam in Panama, which is on the Rio Cabasara, which is the river alongside of which my mother grew up. So through all of these kinds of explorations and research, I decided I needed to create a space for gathering that wasn't just my own production work, but was actually inviting people to contribute to a picture, a collective picturing of water. And this is another source of information and building, which is the rights of the Mother Earth, which is the Bolivian law that gives the Mother Earth rights. And of course, one of the points in the law is the rights of water. Okay, so now to go to just one iteration of the piece, which is this platform that's called Bojo.co. It's a collective storytelling platform that was built by an activist named Sasha Costanza Chalk, and it was built precisely to enable people who don't have internet access to share stories via an online platform through mobile phones. So you can call in stories that are recorded stories, or you can call in images, and anyone can have the phone number and text to it, and then the stories will appear here. So this is a very recent intervention that I've created. I just created the group a month ago and have been sending out invitations to people to contribute via the platform. And it's interesting because a lot of people don't want to contribute to the platform, they want to contribute to me. So I've been receiving lots of written stories and images and movies or links to people's movies, etc. So I'm just kind of aggregating and being the receiver of these things. But these are some of the things that are on the site now, and this will be on display in the gallery. I also want to invite all of you to kind of help think about this with me, which I think this roundtable is designed to do, and over the next few days to help think about the possibilities that this kind of collective practice promises. And also in the space itself, I'm hoping that it becomes an active space of conversation and engagement, so I hope that all of you will take it up. I've also in this space put out paper for people to write things on and put them on the wall. So, you know, there's different ways to engage. So I really hope that you jump in and see where this takes us.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everybody.